Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here to answer that perpetually interesting question, do the classics survive a million repetitions of the same thing? The answer, in short, is no, they don't. We've been told as a marketing ploy by the record labels and the classical music military industrial complex that the great classics are perennially fresh, that they are immortal, that they can withstand a bazillion performances because each one reveals something different and does something. That's all bullshit. It's absolute nonsense. Absolute nonsense. Nobody intended that you should have 500 recordings of Beethoven's Fifth and that each one should be individually interesting and what's more, inure to the glory, the continued perpetuation of the mythos that Beethoven's Fifth is an undying thing. No, it dies. It dies 1,000 deaths. It dies really, really comprehensively when you get to your however many th recording, you finally get your hands on it. Let me explain to you why. Let's talk about it a little bit. Let us consider, first of all, how that line arose. That concept of, the work, the masterpiece, the cultural icon arose in the 19th century as part of the general sort of, romantic nationalist concept of the artist genius, the artist hero, and their works, and also as part of the nationalist identification with certain artistic products as representative of the nation, the ethos of the people, and all of that stuff. It was all very interesting and philosophically just, delicious and totally, completely logically meaningless. So this idea is out there. And it was really a very sensible idea at the time because in the days before electronic media and sound reproduction, you didn't hear this stuff very often. When they said, well, it withstands innumerable repetitions and this and that, what did that mean? It meant you had an orchestra. That orchestra, if you're talking about orchestral music, let's face it, you had an orchestra. That orchestra had a season. That season lasted a couple of months. It contained maybe a dozen or a bit concerts. For example, the Paris Conservatory Orchestra, the season was when the rich people were in town. In those winter months, during the warm months, they all went to the countryside to avoid the cholera epidemic du jour. So you had a few concerts. Works were repeated by popular demand. The programs were much more fluid, and they were much more limited. Much, much more limited in terms of the repertoire that they performed and how frequently they performed it. You didn't get 3 concerts a week of everything and a full year season, a 52-year or 46-year season. None of that happened. None of that happened. So classical music was rare. I mean, seeing these pieces was rare. Even chamber music performances, when music making largely took place in the home. I mean, what took place in the home? Music publishers made a fortune selling arrangements of orchestral works plus chamber music and other things. What happened in the home was whatever happened in a home. I mean, it's not like everybody sat there like this for a music evening where you had professional people performing at the highest standards, the great immortal masterpieces of classical music. They may have owned them. They may have scraped through it. They may have done a movement or two before dinner, or before everyone got up and went to the bathroom or the outhouse or whatever. I mean, it was not music on demand. It was either effortful, like you did it yourself, or it was rare. You went to a concert and heard something, and these pieces acquired their reputation as much in absentia as from the actual act of people being able to listen to them when they wanted to listen to them. I mean, it was very easy to give them that reputation when you couldn't hear them, and it was very good marketing to get people in when you could. So that was the 19th century. And then all of a sudden we had radio and we had recordings, and all of this stuff became ubiquitous. And of course, the same line, the classics, the immortal classics and all that stuff, well, that was very useful for promoting the product. It really was. And people who had not had the opportunity to hear these things finally did get the opportunity to hear them, more or less whenever they felt like it. And others were able to finally sort of just, it became part of the airwaves, part of the culture. You were just surrounded by it. And even that wasn't so terrible because it was still relatively scarce. Originally, recordings were a luxury product for the select few. They weren't popular projects. Instead, unless you did, popular music, large works, because of technological limitations, were still rare. They were scarce. Most, the early 78s, they consist overwhelmingly of, vocal recitals and instrumental recitals and short sniglets, not big, blowsy Mahler and Bruckner symphonies and complete operas and, Gilbert and Sullivan with the dialogue included, none of that stuff. There was none of that completist mentality, But now, of course, we know what we have. We have a bazillion versions of everything. What does it mean to have a bazillion versions of anything? Well, I'm a collector, right? I'm a collector. I collect music. I also collect rocks. I used to collect stamps. I collected things. That was my mentality. I happened to be focusing on music. And, for most of my life, because I adore music. It's not because these things are cultural icons or things that, matter in the grand scheme of things. It's just because it's what I like. And we're all here because it's what you like, which is perfectly reasonable. It's fun being a collector. And it doesn't matter what you collect. You could collect shoes, you could collect music, you could collect sausages, you could collect, anything that's collectible, you collect. Does it matter that you're a collector? Hell no. Does it matter what you collect? Absolutely not. What does it mean, really, to collect Beethoven's Fifth Symphony or any other work? Pick your own. All that means is that you are listening for the differences between one performance and the next. You own the performance in your head. You know what it is. You've already listened to it. You know what it is. You know that you like it. And from that point, all you're doing is listening for differences, tiny differences. And these differences are ephemeral. I mean, the work is 99.9% the same every time you hear it. The rest of it is just doodling. It's doodads. It's like if you're collecting shoes. If you collect shoes, you have loafers, you have sandals, you have dress shoes, you have boots, you have some with brown shoelaces, some with red shoelaces. They're all shoes. And you've determined whether or not you like the particular pair of shoes or you like having lots of choice in shoes, but they're just shoes. It's the same thing with music. It makes absolutely no difference if it's Beethoven's Fifth or Mahler's First or Aida or, Haydn's string quartets. It doesn't matter. What matters is that you're collecting them for the different surface differences that manifest themselves from one performance to the next. And in order to try and convince ourselves that these differences mean something, which I think they don't, by and large, we exaggerate the significance of those differences to an absolutely ridiculous degree. I mean, we all do it. And we talk about things that are easiest to talk about. The things that are easiest to talk about are, easily audible differences. I'll give you an example. The added timpani thwack at the end of the first movement, on the very last note of the first movement of Rachmaninoff's Second Symphony. Dum, bum, 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 thwack. I mean, that's added by many conductors. Rachmaninoff didn't write that. He wrote it for double basses. Dun, 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 like that. That's what he wrote. Now, I usually mention that in performances because it's easy to hear when we're talking about it and I'm explaining what a performance sounds like to somebody. I don't make more out of it than it is. In other words, it's sometimes a useful entree into the discussion of the performance as a whole, the preferences of the artists or the conductors as a whole. But that little tiny difference is completely meaningless. And I have seen comments here saying, oh, well, if they use the timpani thwack, the whole performance is wrong, spoils the whole performance for me. It's like, oh, come on. get your priorities together. It makes no difference at all. But in the grand scheme of things, it's still 99.9% Rachmaninoff's Second Symphony. And if everything else is going wonderfully, who cares? It's just the red shoelace, in that particular version of Rachmaninoff first. And we collect them because we like to hear the performance in marginally different ways. No, the real reason we collect all these performances, and this is the bull in the china shop that nobody wants to talk about. The real reason is that listening to the same thing over and over again is boring. We want to hear differences because if we really love a work, we want to hear it regularly. But if we want to hear it regularly, we don't want to hear the same thing every single time. We want to hear the different possibilities so that we don't get bored. And if the possibility exists that a single performance fixed for all time on a recording will bore us, then the classics are not the immortal, perpetual objects that withstand eternal repetition. I mean, why do we buy different pairs of shoes? Because we use different shoes for different occasions. We don't want to get bored. We don't want to be the same. We want our lives to have variety. And if we want to have variety within the same piece of music, then that same piece of music ain't a classic. It just isn't. Well, it could be a classic, but you know what I mean. It's not a classic the way the mythos that we have been raised to accept actually means. And so I wanted to bring that up because, one of the things that I think everybody who's collecting these things needs to do is to be, and most of you guys know this, I know, but some people don't. And some people aren't being really honest with themselves about what it means to collect this stuff. You are not acquiring culture. You are not acquiring, aesthetic elevation by having 500 versions of the same thing, or by screaming about how one character in an opera, one performer is a zillion times better than another performer. All you're doing is pointing out differences between your shoe collection. That's what you're doing. And it's not a matter of life and death. It's not a matter of, cultural significance. It's just a matter of what pleases us and what we do to give our lives color and interest and variety and to keep things, the experience of this stuff fresh for us because it wasn't going to be. And one of the things I've noticed is that when you only have like one recording of something, chances are after you've played it for the first few times and gotten it into your head, you don't listen to it as often. You're not going to listen to it. You don't need to. You don't need to. And that's the truth. It's just stuff. You're collecting the surface variance from one performance to the next. The work itself, that exists independently, completely independently. So that's my thought on this, on this topic, and I'm curious to get yours. Keep on listening, friends. Thanks so much for joining me. Take care.